Well, thank you to David, and it's very nice that those of you who are here, small but distinguished audience. So, David has correctly said that I've done things in the past. What I haven't done in the past, until he introduced me to Hong Kong, is to have relations with China. In the 1990s, as David said, I was Director of the National Portrait Gallery, and my Chairman of Trustees was now Sir Henry Kesey. And at the time, I was always aware that Hong Kong figured extremely largely in his life. And as we were busy raising money, it did cross my mind that it could have been sensible to have gone out to Hong Kong at that time, since it's become clear to me Henry doesn't, I gather, own quite as much of Hong Kong as he thinks he does. But since his family had been there since the Opium War, he certainly knows his way around not only Hong Kong and China. But in fact, it was only in 2009 that I got a telephone call, probably in about February 2009, from David, who, as he said, is a long-standing trustee of the Royal Academy, saying, would I come out to Hong Kong over Easter? And I said, it wasn't completely straightforward, since I have a family, and I was expecting to celebrate Easter with my family. And he said, no, don't worry, bring your wife too. So we went out to Hong Kong for what was, for me at the time, and in some ways has remained a very significant event for me, that David had organized a big symposium in Hong Kong for pretty well all the leading arts people in this country to talk to people in Hong Kong about the forthcoming, as David pointed out, still forthcoming West Kowloon Cultural District. And David had, with characteristic generosity, said to the Hong Kong government that it could be in their interest to learn from the experience of British institutions about how to run and manage arts organizations, so that it is the only time that I've been on an aeroplane with the director of the Tate, the director of the Serpentine, the director of the South Bank, and everybody except the director of the British Museum who wasn't available. And we talked, director of the V&A was there, with his wife too.
Tom Krantz.
And Tom Krantz flew in from New York just in the closing period of his time as director of the group. We talked in Hong Kong about how to manage arts institutions. And I look back on it as having been an extraordinary event because all the people involved in the arts in Hong Kong came to it, didn't mind what, in retrospect, I think could have been viewed as a slightly patronizing thing of everybody in Britain telling Hong Kong how to run arts organizations. It became clear to me then that there were plenty of people in Hong Kong who knew perfectly well how to run arts institutions, many of them having been trained and worked internationally and already running very successful arts organizations. Leave that on one side. It was, I thought, a very interesting event. Not only did all the arts people come, but people came from the government. I can remember Henry Tang, who was then the Chief Secretary, sat in the fifth row of the stalls all the way through the event, taking notes, asking questions, paying attention to it. I can't think of a comparable event in this country where you would have leading people in the audience over a weekend, over a long weekend, listening to people from the arts about how to run arts institutions. So that was my first experience, and I found it extremely rewarding. And since then, I have tried, and pretty well succeeded, except for this year, to go to Hong Kong at least once a year. David is not my only trustee involved in Hong Kong, because also the chairman of the trust now is Mervyn Davies, Lord Davies, who spent a long time in Hong Kong in the 80s and 90s as finally anyway, chief executive of Standard Chartered, then came back to London to be chairman of Standard Chartered, and then went into the Labour administration, and now sits on, as far as I can get, lost count of the number of boards he sits on. But he said, if the Royal Academy was to be involved with Hong Kong and China, you couldn't do it by half measures. You had to do it systematically, and you had to do it consistently. And you shouldn't think, which I suspect some British institutions do, that it's a good place to raise money without any active involvement. And that's the advice we followed ever since. That actually, in the hope that one day we might raise money there, before we do that, we've got to establish good and close links. I've mainly gone out each year to the Hong Kong Art Fair because I found that a helpful and useful opportunity to see what's going on in Hong Kong, meet all the relevant people who are there for obvious reasons for the art fair, and also have an opportunity to see work from China. I mean, having just come back from the Basel Art Fair, which I went to for the first time, the great thing, as far as I'm concerned, about the Hong Kong Art Fair is the opportunity of seeing work from China alongside work from Europe. It's perfectly possible to meet the dealers from London. In London, you don't have to go to Hong Kong, but what I found it's very helpful is to meet the dealers, meet the galleries, and see the work from mainland China. That really is just by way of introduction to the extent to which I've been involved, and now, more formally, I'm going to go on to talk about two issues. First is the ways in which the Royal Academy historically has shown works of art from China. And then, secondly, the ways in which people from the Royal Academy have recently been doing much, much more, not only in China, but not only in Hong Kong, but in mainland China, in Beijing and Shanghai. So, this was the question which David asked me to answer: what is the relevance of China to the Royal Academy of Art? And I will try to answer it in the next 20 minutes or so. I will leave time for questions and discussion because David said, which I'm sure is correct, you will have views and questions you want to ask. This is a well-known to everybody at the Academy picture of the Academy at the beginnings by an artist called Johann Zoffany, who came from Germany and was much patronized by George III. It's a way of showing the nature of the Academy. It was founded in 1768. As you see, the painting was painted in 1772. The assumption is it was commissioned by the king, it's still in the Royal collection, as a way of celebrating the foundation of the Royal Academy. Now, at this point, I could ask for those of you as to what the relevance is to our relationship with China. There are two things, and since I can't get the pointer to work, I'm going to point it on the screen. That's Reynolds, the first president, with his ear trumpet. He's listening to the first secretary, Francis Milner Newton. And behind him is William Chambers, who was a already very well-established architect. Chambers was Scottish. He'd been born in Gothenburg in Sweden, and then he had worked for this Swedish China company. He had been to China twice in the 1740s. In his 20s, he went out to China, he came back, and then he trained as an architect. He trained as an architect in Paris and Rome. I mean, it will become evident, and if I were to go through each of these artists in turn, which I don't plan to do, the Academy, when it was established, was extraordinarily cosmopolitan. People travelled. I mean, I've just come back from Edinburgh, where I went to the opening of an exhibition of the artist Jean-Étienne Lyotard, which comes to the Academy in October. He was Swiss, born in Geneva. He then went to train, as many of them did, in Rome. In Rome, he met two British aristocrats. The two British aristocrats said, "We're just going off to Constantinople." So he went with them as a draftsman to Constantinople by way of Smyrna. And then from Constantinople, he went to Moravia. From Moravia, he went to Vienna. And then he arrived in London at the invitation of the two aristocrats in 1753. And then, for the rest of his life, he was traveling around Europe. Most of these people traveled very widely around Europe. Chambers had been to China. He was the tutor to the young George, Prince of Wales, before George became king. And it's fairly obvious to me, if you look at the documentation, that Chambers probably talked to the king about the idea of establishing an academy when he was acting as tutor to the king. George III succeeded in 1760, and Chambers was one of the 4 people who went to see George III on the 28th of November 1768 to say, "We would like to establish an academy." Chambers did a Chinese building in Kew and did a dissertation on Chinese gardens, so that there was an awareness of China in 1768 at the time that the Royal Academy was established. And the second person, I will get up merely to point the person out. There's a Chinese artist there. His name was Tang, and he was visiting London in 1768, in the 1760s. And although he was not an academician, he was a modeler, and you had to be resident in London. He was only a visitor. He was sufficiently interesting as a visitor to be incorporated in the picture of the early academicians, so that right from the beginning there was a sense of possible relationship with China. And my sense of the foundation of the academy was that right from the beginning it was very international and very cosmopolitan. I can't find any evidence of relations between the Royal Academy and China in the 19th century, but we go on to the fact that what happened in the history of the Academy is that in 1868, 100 years after we were founded, we opened the new building, which we're still in, on Piccadilly. And it was built with absolutely magnificent exhibition galleries. I still think amongst the greatest and best exhibition galleries in the world. When I was at the National Gallery, where the exhibition galleries are subterranean, I went around America looking at possible models for exhibition galleries. Most exhibition galleries are just designed as warehouse spaces. The Royal Academy galleries were designed as grand, top-lit galleries for the display of the summer exhibition. But the summer exhibition is only on in the summer. And quite quickly they realized that they had these great exhibition galleries, and they started doing exhibitions of old master paintings from British collections in the 1870s and 1880s. There were a whole series of exhibitions, mainly from country houses, so the country house collections could be seen in London. By the 1920s, this program had evolved into big exhibitions, which were the origin of the modern blockbuster. I think many people think that blockbusters were invented in 1972 with the Tutankhamun exhibition in the British Museum. But if you look at the history of major exhibitions, actually the Royal Academy was key in developing the genre of great exhibitions. In the 1920s, there were major exhibitions of Dutch paintings. There was an Iranian exhibition. There was a huge, very important exhibition in 1930, organized by Kenneth Clark, And in 1935, autumn and spring 1935 to 1936, there was a Great China Exhibition. So that the history of the Royal Academy is showing work from China, acting as an important ambassador in the relationship with China, goes back essentially in the 20th century to the 1930s. I know from my old friend and former colleague, Craig Clunas, who's the professor about history in Oxford, that there's an increasing amount of scholarly interest in this exhibition in the 1930s to see what was said, what was shown, what the interpretation was of Chinese art at the time. I assume I haven't heard from him in detail, but I know he's got people working on this. I sometimes think we ought to consider redoing it. I'm not going to go through all the Chinese exhibitions. There was a big exhibition in 1973, 1974 called The Genius of China. I have the catalogue so that I may have been taken, but I can't pretend to remember it. I'm going to go to the more recent relationships where we have built up increasingly systematic relationships. In 2003 to, you can see, to 2005, an organization called the Red Mansion Foundation arranged for quite a number of academicians to spend time in China. They went out and there was a small exhibition. I attended the opening, I remember it. Well, I remember it particularly well because I arrived at the dinner and there was no place for me. But John Bellamy, Paul Huxley, Alan Jones, David Mack, Ian McKeever, and Chris Orr, they all went out to China and spent time there. Paul Huxley, as an example, has spent time every year since, because it's very stimulating. I think many of them have exhibited in China since then, and as I say, I know, because Paul Huxley was the treasurer of the RA, he found it enormously stimulating and has maintained very close relations. This I should really show the poster. Sorry, it's hooked up. But this shows the political significance of the exhibition which was held in 2006, called China, the Three Emperors.
There was a bit of a hoo-ha because there was a splendid painting of Emperor Qianlong at the entrance, and we had a telephone call from the Chinese embassy saying that the president would not like to be photographed in front of the Chinese emperor, and we had to remove it. We had to cover it up.
I found it intriguing and sometimes slightly surprising that the Royal Academy is a private institution. It's not in any way funded by government. And yet, a lot of the exhibitions, the history of the exhibitions, are that they are often more political, inverted commas, than exhibitions have been involved with at other institutions. And that's to do, I think, with the history, that it has a long history of doing big pioneering exhibitions. The scale of the exhibitions, because they're so big, they often involve diplomatic relations. I've spent much more time talking to embassies about loans, about what might come. I mean, at the weekend I was discussing with the director of the National Gallery of Australia the key loan and the significance of that. So that there's this slight paradox where private, but in terms of the significance of exhibitions, they're often very key. I was involved with this installation by Shen Huang. Soon after I started, I was approached by Harry Blaine and Graham Southern, who represent the work of Shen Huang in London, and they said, could they arrange for the installation of a work in the courtyard of the Royal Academy? We will sometimes show work in the courtyard of the Royal Academy, only provided we don't have to pay for it. And I think it's a very good showcase of work. And at that point, his work was not that familiar. He had an exhibition at the Gary Hodgmanson of the top end of Bond Street when they were still in Bond Street, and we showed this work. It originally, we had to cancel it, unfortunately. I only saw it once. It smokes, and I remember very vividly coming in one day into the courtyard, and the whole courtyard was filled with smoke, which was very exciting, but it only happened once, because it wasn't very popular with the neighbours. So that it's not only a sculpture, but it was a sort of smoking cauldron. Next of these sort of relationships which we've been building up, we did an exhibition now last year in the spring, 18 months ago, called Sensing Spaces. Sensing Spaces was, by our standards, an experimental exhibition showing contemporary architecture, trying to get people to respond to architecture in a different and new way. I certainly think it was very successful in drawing new audiences to the Academy. Traditionally, we've tended to have an older, middle-class audience. We got many, many, many younger people, families, people interested in contemporary architecture. We invited 6 practitioners from all over the world to do an installation in one of the great spaces. And this was the installation done by Tang. I'm absolutely sure my pronunciation is not very good. And it was one of the, I think, very successful installations, introduced his work to an audience in London. That covers briefly, probably a bit superficially, things we've done in London about China. And now I'm going to go on and talk a bit about things that academicians themselves have been doing in China. I started, for obvious reasons, with the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which is a key work in Hong Kong, is a key work in the career of Norman Foster. It's an even more key work in the career of Spencer de Grey, who was the project architect, whose father, Roger de Grey, was president of the Royal Academy, and Spencer himself is now an academician, and he lived out in Hong Kong between 1979 and 1986 when it opened. And it's a landmark building, and I know perfectly well, as you will all know, that Norman Foster has gone on to do a great deal of work in Hong Kong, including, not least, doing the master plan for the West Kowloon Cultural District. The overall layout, although I think he's not yet, anyway, doing any of the individual projects. This is a recent work by Richard Wilson, RA. Sorry, hopped over. We have an informal relationship with the Peninsula Hotel, and they are commissioning artworks from RAs. And this was a work which was launched literally at the time of this year's Hong Kong Art Fair. But as I've said, it's the first year I haven't been able to get to the Hong Kong Art Fair. David, you were probably there.
Yes, of course. I was there. Yes, it was amazing. And we were all slightly apprehensive about standing at the entrance of the Peninsula. There's the bus suddenly sort of collapsed onto us. But it was amazing, and lots of people looked at it. I was absolutely amazed that they managed to get over the authorities to erect it, because it was quite precariously perched, and imagine the health and safety and all the regulations. But it was amazing.
It's quite, because the Peninsula group presumably is not the most avant-garde group.
Well, that's precisely why they're doing it. I mean, it's one of the iconic hotels, and they did it in the old wing, as you can see. That's the facade of the building that was built in the 30s and 40s, and it really was very effective.
Next, I've already accidentally shown the Tracy Emin, which was the previous work, My Heart Is With You Always, which was the previous work commissioned by the Minister Hotel. Then next, show some examples of academicians showing work in Hong Kong. Many of you will almost certainly know that a great number of galleries have now opened up. One of them was White Cube. Anthony Gormley is the leading RA. I saw this exhibition at the time. And I think it's representative of the increasing amount of exchange, that clearly the evidence in the Hong Kong Art Fair is the internationalization of the art world, and the fact that there are galleries, number of galleries, not only White Cube, but Brown is in Hong Kong.
Gagosian
is London and Hong Kong. And I guess in the Penn building, I've forgotten how many galleries there are, but every floor has at least one gallery. And that means that rather academicians' work is seen on a very regular basis. There is another slide. Here it goes. Tony Bevan. It's not always sort of predictable which of the RAs have a presence in Hong Kong. Tony Bevan, I know, is shown pretty regularly with Ben Brown. Sean Scully is a recent RA who has just had a big retrospective expo. I think it was retrospective in both Beijing and in Shanghai. So that that's representative of the move now to Shanghai and Beijing. So that I think the next step of what we'll be doing is looking not just at Hong Kong, but also to Beijing and Shanghai. There's so many museums. Well, you'll see it in a minute. I visited there. Paul Huxley, I've already mentioned, has very good relations in China, works with the art schools, and goes out pretty well every year. It's an example of work he showed in Beijing. Once a year in London, under the auspices of Jake Rothschild, and one year must have been in 2006. There was a Chinese representative. They said, next year we're going to hold a meeting in Beijing. So we held a meeting in Beijing. That was the first time I went. To be honest, I found it absolutely, totally impossible to get a sense of Beijing, because all I saw was the back of a minibus stuck in traffic. So that I took myself back there a year or so ago in order to be able to get a better sense of it on the ground. In fact, I realized after a few days I'd done exactly the same as I'd done the previous time, but at least this time I was told what I was doing in advance, and I had a sense of it, and I was able to engage with the institutions I went to, I think better. So we went to the Central Academy of Fine Art, with whom we now have informal relations. This was, for me, a rather moving occasion. I know perfectly well that Ai Weiwei has a pretty ambiguous reputation in China, but we elected him as an honorary Royal Academician. This month's art newspaper has on the front page an article in which he says how pleased and surprised he was to be elected an honorary RA, since he'd never been to art school. But I appeared. One of the things I do when somebody is elected as an RA is I have to read a piece which was written on the 14th of December 1768. I will have to read it this afternoon to introduce a new Royal Academician, so that I took his diploma work for British RAs, the diploma work, the diploma which you see Ai Weiwei holding is signed by the Queen. For honorary academicians it's not, but Ai Weiwei know the difference. He was surprised to be greeted by the Secretary and Chief Executive of the Royal Academy, who came on a special visit. I gave him the diploma and then read the piece of 18th century prose telling him about his duties and obligations as an honorary academician. And then we were photographed. I was told afterwards that I should have said more, but as his English isn't very good, as my Chinese is non-existent, it seemed to be just standing there was sufficient. And actually, I found the mere fact of being there and presenting it was rather moving. And actually, I do a blog. The blog of the day I handed the certificate to Ai Weiwei is still, by a long way, the record number of people reading it. So I've never managed to get anything like the number of visitors to the blog. We then went to Shanghai to visit Chen Huang's studio, which studio is in a way the wrong way of describing it. It's a factory, it's on a simply massive scale. Very remarkable, very varied work, and providing an opportunity of seeing his work in situ. And then I think this is the last slide, which is work done by Wilkinson. Behind the work that we're doing institutionally is the fact that many academicians are involved, particularly the architects, in doing work in China. Chris Wilkinson, who's a very active academician, goes out to China frequently. This is the work he's done recently in Guangzhou. Pretty confident he's doing other work in cities. He now has an office, I think, in Guangzhou. Zaha Hadid, who's a friend of David's, is pretty active in China. And Norman Foster, obviously, is very active, I think, not only in Hong Kong, but also in Shanghai. So now, that covers the background, but I want to end with the fact, which was one of the reasons David asked me to speak here, which is that in September we are opening a big Ai Weiwei exhibition. And by way of conclusion, I'm going to do something and show a short film which we've made about the Ai Weiwei film, about the Ai Weiwei exhibition, which I haven't seen myself. And actually, you're not to talk about it because we're helping to fund it through crowdfunding. I'm not supposed to say this, but I can't prevent myself from saying it. Because of the controversy around Ai Weiwei, we have not succeeded in getting conventional commercial sponsorships. Because basically, any company has relations with mainland China, or they don't, they certainly want to. And therefore, big companies are a bit cautious. So that we are doing something we've never done before, which is we've made a relationship with Kickstarter, the American crowdfunding organization. And they are about to launch a campaign, and you are seeing, in advance the launch of the campaign, the video which launches the campaign, so that you're not to talk about it until later in the week when it's much more formally. This is the informal launch. Okay, off we go. That's always the way with technology.
Hello, my name is Stephen Fry, and I'm a trustee of, and more importantly, I'm very happy visitor to the Royal Academy here in London. The Academy is made up of the leading artists and architects in Britain, and it's an independent charity that puts on some of the most spectacular shows and exhibitions in all of Europe. We're incredibly excited this year to be showing the work of Ai Weiwei, one of the world's most famous and extraordinary artists, social critic, sculptor, restorer, video artist. He does absolutely everything.
He stands for something that we all stand for, which is, you know, the right to be different, the right to not conform, the right to speak out, the right to be a human being. He's the world's principled non-conformist, and I think, you know, we like to think we're non-conformists.
This will be the first major institutional show by Ai Weiwei in Britain, and he's going to fill our main galleries with spectacular, visionary, ambitious, brave and provocative works. The very first thing that visitors will experience is a vast, monumental 8-part tree sculpture built site-specifically in this courtyard. And of course, it's free for all visitors to enjoy.
Weiwei has taken pieces of wood that died naturally, collected on the mountains of southern China that he's purchased from markets in southern China and transported back to Beijing, where he reassembles trees. So he's creating what he thinks the tree would have originally looked like before it was taken apart. When you turn the corner from Piccadilly and walk into the courtyard, you're going to be struck by the fact that there are these 8 trees standing there. It'll be a kind of historic moment, it'll be a wonderful moment, and they will really give a sense of occupation, I think. It'll be kind of magical, slightly unreal experience, transporting yourself from one world into another.
This Kickstarter project is a unique opportunity to get involved and bringing incredible new works here to London.
If you support this exhibition, you're kind of part of it, and that would be, I think that would be a wonderful thing to do.
So join us, be a part of this amazing project, be a patron of the arts, facilitate free speech. Please, spread the word.
This must be the space which tells you how to do it.